I would argue that one incredibly important trait they have, which we could learn an awful lot from, is their incredibly strong social bonds. They have incredibly strong drive to support each other and to engage cooperatively in tasks. I think that sense of cooperation and strong family ties and looking after one another is one of the best resources that elephants have, and I think it's something that we as humans could learn an awful lot from.
Thank you, Lisa, for joining me on the podcast today. I really wanted to talk to you because recently, there's been a lot of love for zoos and for conservation efforts of animals because of, the lockdown and I guess the loss of income and tourism and stuff from because of the coronavirus and the pandemic. And people have really noticed it, and there's been, a lot of campaigning and lobbying, in the UK, but I think in other places in Europe, maybe not in the US, I'm not sure, we can talk about that later. But there's also, I think, still a lot of people who are really unsure about, what's good for animals in zoos and what's right. And, there's a lot of confusion about captivity, especially as we move ever closer into a world where being in the wild is very, very dangerous, if not more so. So, yeah, I just kind of wanted to have a really good chat with you about all of that and about elephants, because they're just majestic, wonderful, amazing creatures. And I just want to get really nerdy about elephants, honestly. Feel free to dive in and just go for it, because I love it, and I think a lot of people are really interested in it as well. So I know that you've done a lot of work with UK and Western zoos, and also sort of out in the field with elephants that are sort of captive in their natural habitats. So it just sort of wondered where you started and how you move between the two.
My story with elephants started back when I was still at vet school in North America, in the US, at Cornell University. And at that time, I was a student at the school, but I knew that I wanted to work with wildlife. I just hadn't quite figured out how. And I was fortunate enough to be able to meet an amazing woman by the name of Katie Payne, who works at Cornell University and in particular works with the Laboratory of Ornithology, studying elephant sound, infrasound. She's actually the person who discovered infrasound, which is the very low frequency sound that elephants use to communicate. And she and I had quite a number of discussions about my interest in wildlife. And she talked to me about some of her work with elephants. And she said, well, why don't you study elephants? There's so much we still don't know about them. And so I started reading and talking to other people and chatted some more with Katie. And I just got hooked. They're just amazing animals. And so I did a little bit of research studying them when I was still a vet student. And then after I finished, I knew I wanted to do a PhD and really wanted to do something with elephants. And I was fortunate enough to be able to organize something with my supervisor out in California at UC Davis, Bill Lasley, who very kindly agreed to take me on with the project that I kind of suggested. I had started doing some work when I was still a student looking at must, which is this phenomenon that occurs in bull elephants where they get very high levels of the hormone called testosterone. They become very aggressive and very dangerous, but also it's a time where they compete with other males a lot and have a much better chance of getting access to females to mate them. And so I wanted to study the hormones involved in must in bull elephants, and that took me out to Thailand. And so for my PhD, I actually worked with elephants at a captive facility out in Thailand, because there's a large number of elephants out there. And I spent with my husband a number of years living out in Thailand and doing my research. And then once I finished and I was looking for a job. I ended up I was very fortunate in getting a job here at the University of Nottingham at the School of Veterinary Medicine and Science, just a year actually after it had first started. And so I became involved in working with the vet school, and the vet school works very closely with one of the clinical associates that it has, which is Twycross Zoo. And so I worked both with the elephants at Twycross Zoo, which they had when I started, and very shortly after that became involved in a government advisory committee here in the UK called the Elephant Welfare Group, which is working very closely with UK zoos to try and help them to assess welfare in their elephants and to improve the welfare in their elephants. And we've worked very closely in partnership with our colleagues at the many zoos across the UK that do have captive elephants. And they've been working very, very hard over many years to make continual improvements to how they're caring for their elephants. And I think in many ways have been really leading the way in trying to improve the welfare of captive elephants. And many of the things that I've learned in my work with our colleagues here in the UK, I've then been able to apply to work with colleagues out in Thailand, and also now in Southern Africa, in Zimbabwe and Zambia and South Africa, trying to find ways to work with folks out there to improve the way that they're managing their elephants to help improve their welfare.
Okay, so it's kind of like you started off here and now you're sort of trying to take it around the world to different places.
Yes, very much so.
That's incredible. Yeah. So before you got into the more of the welfare stuff, how long did you spend on studying elephants? You said you spent a lot of time on bull elephants, because I think they're really interesting, because we sort of think of elephant herds and how they sort of, they stick together and they have these really strong social bonds, but the males are really, they leave. I mean, are there things that we don't know about them, or are they just?
To be honest, so you mentioned sort of elephants in the wild as well, and animals in the wild, and elephants, like very, very many different wildlife species, their numbers are really dwindling out in the wild as humans continue to encroach upon the landscape. Elephants are quite land use intensive animals, and so are we, and so unfortunately we're very much outcompeting them, and there's dwindling territory for them. So with respect to bull elephants, though, in particular, you'd asked me about. So what's interesting is we know, certainly much of what we know about elephant behavior and elephant natural history comes from the work that colleagues have done over very, very many years. Cynthia Moss and Joyce Poole and Phyllis Lee, studying elephants at Amboseli in Kenya, and they've done an incredible job with this very, very long-term study looking at the behavior of these elephants in the wild. And so much of our understanding of elephant behavior and the natural history of elephants and how they live comes from this work that these colleagues have done. With respect to Asian elephants, there's actually an awful lot we still don't know about them in particular, because they are very difficult to study. So in Africa, the African savanna elephants are living, as the name says, out mostly on the savanna, and it's much easier to see them from a distance and to observe them and to do really detailed behavioral observations, which our colleagues have done. But there are a lot of challenges, particularly with the Asian elephants, because they live in forests and jungles, and so they're mostly hidden by the trees, and it can be really challenging to do detailed longitudinal behavioral observations on them. One of my colleagues and friends, Sherman De Silva, has the longest running study of Asian elephants in the wild out in Sri Lanka, where she's been studying them for more than 10 years. But because elephants are so long lived in the wild, 50, 60, or even 70 years, there's still a lot we need to learn about Asian elephants in particular.
Yeah.
But with respect to bull elephants, what we do know about bull elephants is that there seems to be this myth about them that they're solitary, and they're very much not solitary animals. So when they reach puberty, they leave their natal herd, the herd that they were born into, and they go off and they form these bachelor herds. So they'll hang out with other males, some males sort of similar to them in age and some older males. And for them, having those older males around in particular is really important because elephants engage in a lot of what's called social learning. So they'll learn a lot from older elephants around them. And that's true for the females as well. But for our bulls, it's important that they have these older bulls around to learn how to behave socially with other bulls and also how to behave with the ladies. So they need to learn breeding behavior from these older bulls. And so when we think about how we're keeping them in captivity, that information is incredibly important, and we need to use our understanding of how they live in the wild to hopefully help inform how we should best manage them in captivity. And so one of the things that many zoos are working towards now, and certainly in the UK, I know a lot of our colleagues are working towards trying to manage elephants in these multi-generational family herds, for the females, but also for the bulls, managing them ideally either in bachelor herds with other bulls or if the space permitted, to have sort of bachelor herds and family herds, but the opportunity for the males to mix with the females so that they can breed in a more natural way and socialize in a more natural way. So I know of some bull elephants in captive facilities here in the UK that actually live with family groups, and they don't have unfettered access to them, but they have some opportunity to socialize with those family herds, and they do, and they'll play with the cows in the herd, and they'll mix with the females. And I think that that's incredibly important for captive bulls to have that opportunity. I think that we've done them a real injustice historically by isolating them and having them all by themselves. I think that's not very nice for them, and certainly not how they live in the wild.
Yeah, they're going to live with, traditionally what would be just female families and the children, and clearly they're adaptable and they have very strong social needs if they can sort of mold them to be with sort of any elephants that are near them. How did the young bulls find older bulls in the wild? Like, are they ones that they're related to? Can they find them again, or is it?
That's a really interesting question. And you mentioned before, you alluded to the fact that there's probably a lot we don't know. And I would say that's probably one of those things we need to understand better. I think there is some preliminary evidence that there might be some relatedness, at least among some of them. But I think that they potentially might also be just hanging out with other bulls that they encounter and that they seem to get on with. I mean, elephants, just like humans and just like many other animals, have some other elephants that they like and get along with, and some that they don't like so much and don't get along with. And so it's really important, particularly when we think about managing them in a captive way, that they have that opportunity, if they don't get along so well, to get away from each other. They have that space and that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. The freedom and the choice to who you hang out with is pretty fundamental to your happiness. You mentioned earlier, social learning and the calves. How do elephants sort of teach and pass on knowledge? Because they live for a long time, right?
They do, and actually in the wild, a lot of it comes from for the females in particular, from the older matriarchs, the older elephants in the herd, and those matriarchs pass along all kinds of knowledge. I mean, that can vary from where to go during the dry season to find water. That's a really, really important one for many elephants, but also just other cues, how to respond to what's going on in the environment, what's dangerous, when they need to move along and get out of the way, and when it's okay to stay where they are. There's an awful lot that they learn from older elephants, and particularly for the females from that old matriarch who kind of looks after the herd.
Is it just a sort of physically showing the paths to water, and then they just have recognized sort of landmarks around?
I think probably just like with humans and with many other species, it's probably a combination of things. Some of it is, kind of follow me and I'll show you stuff. And the others is just kind of observational learning, where we and they will watch others performing behaviors and kind of mimic that, model it. You model our own behavior on what we see and observe. And also kind of with the youngsters learning what's not okay. So getting scolded or told off in some way for doing things that are a bit naughty.
So they create associations just like we do, and then we're just like all.
I mean, I think obviously every animal has their own type of society and their own way of communicating, but I think it's probably not unreasonable to draw some parallels with our understanding of human behavior or behavior in, let's say, in other animals that we are familiar with.
You mentioned working with Katie Payne when she sort of, or since she's sort of found out about their communication. How does that work, and what is the sort of like max that we know about that? Because obviously they can stomp, and an elephant many miles away will sense that, but is there more use to it than that?
Yes, well, so I got to know Katie years after she had discovered infrasound, but she was doing other work with elephants and continued to, and has continued to throughout her professional life. But with respect to infrasound, so she's the person who discovered that elephants use infrasound, but there have been quite a lot of other researchers and scientists who have continued to try and study and understand what it means. And again, I think that's one of those things where there's plenty of work still to be done. I think we know some things about what some of these specific infrasonic calls mean. So there's some that they will produce, they will vocalize, they'll make these sounds in certain circumstances. And so there's things we can do to try and help figure out what some of these vocalizations mean, like what they call record and playback experiments, where you play back a recorded sound to two animals and see how they react to it and see if they react in the way you expect, so that it sort of is communicating what we think it's communicating. Obviously, we always have to infer to some extent, because we can't know what's going on in the minds of other humans, let alone other animals and different species. But what we do know with respect to infrasound, it travels over very long distances, as you said. It can be many kilometers that it travels, and it travels both through the air and through the ground. And so we know that the elephants have these vibrational sensors in their feet that can help pick up infrasonic vibrations, as well as detecting it through their ears, and it can travel in vibrations through their body, through the bones, so that the elephants can detect those infrasonic vocalizations. We know that they use vocalizations to coordinate movement over distance, and so there have been some really amazing studies where people have shown that elephants many kilometers distant, a number of kilometers distant from each other, will coordinate, two different herds will coordinate their movements with each other. So they're moving in parallel across the landscape. And we infer that that's being done, that they're coordinating that by using things like infrasonic vocalizations. One of the other things that we do know about infrasound is that elephants are not the only animals that produce it. Quite a number of other species do. But what we also know is, unfortunately, humans make noise pollution that is infrasonic. And so we're kind of creating this either just kind of chaotic noise jumble for elephants, or confusing them, or masking their own vocalization. So we know that jet engines create infrasound, wind turbines create infrasound, even a lot of our lorries on the motorways create infrasound. And so one of the things that is important to think about is many of our zoos, we know, are located in cities or near cities, or in places where there might be a lot of flights flying over, or large roadways that are nearby. So there's noise from the nearby traffic. And that can create a lot of kind of background noise, a lot of it potentially, that might not be that pleasant for elephants. And they just screen it out. Now, we all obviously live sometimes or operate or work in environments that can be quite noisy. So I think that we and other animals can filter noise out, but obviously it can become kind of annoying and a background stressor to elephants and other animals.
Yeah, absolutely. It's proven to cause psychological stress to us to live near sort of busy roads and stuff. And isn't there some similar work going on in the ocean with sort of large whales and dolphins who are getting stressed by shipping and things that
yes,
we dump
absolutely.
in there. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, in physically in zoos, have you been looking at how it affects captive elephants there, or even just, when the crowds come in, do they?
Well, so I think many zoos have done work looking at elephant responses or animal responses to human presence, to visitors, to tourists. And there are a great many studies that have been done across a great number of zoos by many, many different students who are interested in looking at this. And I think that certainly there can be an impact. I think, again, it's one of those things we need to learn more about. With respect to infrasound, there was a colleague of mine at Nottingham Trent University who did a study with a master's student looking at infrasonic sort of noise pollution, if you will, in the environment, as well as infrasonic vocalizations by the elephants. Interestingly, the work that was done, the zoo was near roadways and potentially with some flight paths. And there was quite a lot of infrasonic noise that was produced by human sort of causes, these motorways and airplane sounds, and the infrasound that was produced by the elephants was in a similar frequency range, and so potentially there is overlap, and that could be quite potentially, I would imagine, annoying or frustrating, depending on the sort of the volume of those noises that are interfering or overlapping with elephant infrasound. But what was really good to find out, because they also did some recordings inside the elephant house. And interestingly, the elephant house itself, that structure was able to screen out a lot of that outside noise. And so when the elephants were inside, they weren't bothered by all that infrasonic noise pollution that we were making. But I think it's one of those things, to be quite honest with you, I think there's plenty of room for further work to be done on that. There's a lot we still really don't know about the nature of the infrasound that's produced by us and how much that affects elephants or indeed other species at zoos or in captive settings.
Yeah, it's just something, we don't sense it, so we wouldn't think of it, right?
Exactly. I think it's just one of those things that's kind of outside of our experience and outside of our awareness.
Yeah. But that's why research like yours is so crucial to the survival of this species, if you were to ripple it out that way. You said about them sort of like going out to find water, and do you think there might be other sort of heightened senses that they have in sensing the world around them as well, or is it just a very, very good memory and a very, very big ears and very big feet?
Well, to be honest, probably, I don't think we can easily answer that question. I suspect that for many species, and elephants included, there's just an awful lot we still don't fully understand about how they perceive the world. As you probably know, there's a lot we still don't understand about how humans perceive the world, and also how we filter that information. And one of the challenges when you're studying other species is they have a different anatomy, a different physiology. Their bodies work in different ways, and it's very, very hard to kind of get our heads inside theirs and really know and understand how they're perceiving the world. I think that certainly we know that their hearing is different, that they hear in different ranges to ours. This infrasonic vocalization or infrasonic noise perception that they have that we don't is probably one really good example. And I suspect in the coming years, there will probably be more that we find out that elephants and other animals can do and perceive in terms of their senses that we don't.
Because I think I read when looking at Katie Payne before, when you suggested that I did, that they discovered not too long ago, really, that elephants are able to tell the difference between a crowd of tourists and a crowd of potential locals who may inflict harm on them, which is, how are they able to do that? Did you see?
I don't know the quick answer to that. I suspect it's probably a combination of sound and of smell, potentially, and a whole lot of related cues. So I suspect tourists, by and large, are going to be noisier. They're not going to be worried so much about masking their noise, and they're present in a larger number. I suspect poachers, for example, people that are coming to hunt and kill elephants, they'll be trying to be more quiet. They'll be carrying guns, so there will be a visual cue. But I imagine that there's all kinds of associated cues, the kinds of vehicles that they come in. So tourist vehicles will probably there'll be a certain kind of vehicle which will have a certain sound and produce a different kind of auditory footprint, if you will, to a vehicle, or even people coming on foot to try and hunt and poach the elephants.
Yeah, they're much cleverer than we would give them credit for, I'm sure. When they're out in the wild still, in their herds, are their herds quite cohabitating, or are they kind of a bit tribal with each other?
Well, it's interesting. And again, I think it's one of those things that certainly for Asian elephants, the sort of the core unit seems to be more mom and baby, and then they'll mix with other elephants, and there's they live in what's called a fission fusion society, where they'll come together, they'll join together with other elephants for a while, and then they'll split apart again. And some of that is dependent on the availability of resources like food and water. And if it's very scarce, then they'll probably split up and go their separate ways and wander quite a bit looking for it. We do know that for African elephants, there is quite a strong sort of core family group, which includes mom, babies, cousins, sisters, brothers, aunties, mother, grandma, and they will all stay in quite a tight group. But then they will come together with other sort of more distantly related herds, and they'll form quite close aggregations for a while, and they can do that and then again split apart into their smaller family herds and come together and split apart. So I think that it's safe to say that their family bonds are incredibly strong, and they will look after each other as well, in as much as we can understand that. They will help out other elephants in distress that they encounter.
Right. And they can, obviously, they know who is who after they've split off from the groups, and then they see them many years later.
Yes, absolutely. And from what I understand, that they also express what we would interpret as excitement, as joy, exuberance, and seeing one another. There's sort of this extensive greeting that they go through when they meet up again, and they really seem to take pleasure in each other's company as well.
I can just imagine the noises and the flapping and that. But I mean, going back to that, they live really, really long time. Do you think that the older elephants alive now sort of understand the changes that have happened in their habitats, and how much harder it is now to find the resources that you need, or going back to a certain place and the water's dried up? How would you think they interpret that?
Oh, it's hard to know. Again, we barely understand each other's thought processes as humans. It's hard to know what goes on in the minds of elephants. I think elephants are incredibly smart, and I think they're incredibly adaptable. So I would imagine that while they would find it potentially stressful or concerning, because then if they go to a place and the resource that they're looking for isn't there, then they'll have to move on to another place, perhaps. Well, they'll also be aware of that resource. So, but I'm sure it will involve an element of both stress and adaptation. We do see elephants adapting, but obviously that becomes increasingly more difficult as we encroach more and more on the landscape and decrease the land that is available for elephants to use. And that's increasingly becoming a problem. So across all of the places where wild elephants live, there is increasingly what's known as human-elephant conflict, where elephants are encountering humans that didn't used to be there. And the difficulty is that humans are obviously, they're not doing it to be difficult. They're moving into space that's available because they need to find places to look after their families and places to live and potentially to farm. But the difficulty comes in that elephants will come into these places where humans now are, and they'll eat up tasty crops that farmers have planted potentially, or they might knock down structures, including houses where people are living. And so the humans then will sometimes retaliate. They will put out snares for the elephants, or they'll shoot them, or they'll put out food to poison them, because they're frightened of them or concerned, and often quite understandably so. Elephants are very large and can be incredibly dangerous to humans. And so it's a very, very challenging situation. And so, we alluded to the fact that elephants are facing threats out in the wild. They're increasingly under risk. And it has been suggested that in the next few decades, it's quite possible that elephants will go extinct in the wild, that we'll no longer have these wild elephant herds, and that the only places where we will continue to have elephants living is in some kind of semi-managed, semi-captive or fully captive state.
Yeah, which is again why your work is so crucial. If not just so that they can survive, but actually live and have some sort of quality of life that would be similar or mirror what they would have in the wild. So on that, do you think it's really possible for elephants to be truly happy in a zoo or in a sort of park? Because I don't think there's many humans who would be totally happy in knowing they were in some kind of captivity, or that there was a sort of encroachment on their full freedom.
Yeah, it's a tricky one to answer, and I don't think that there's a simple answer. I do think that there are a lot of challenges to managing elephants in captivity, and as we know, elephants in the wild have incredibly large home ranges, hundreds or even thousands of square kilometers that they range over, and obviously, clearly, we can't provide that in a zoo setting. And ideally, we'd want to provide that in a range country, in a habitat and a climate that they're adapted to. But I think in captivity, there's certainly things that we can do to try and improve the well-being of those elephants. I think, and I think that even elephants in the wild, we sort of think about them in this sort of idealized sort of state out in the wild, and that's clearly not the case. There are many, many threats that adversely affect elephant welfare out in the wild. There's drought, there's starvation, there's poaching or hunting, there's predation by other animals, there's diseases, there's lots of different risks that they face in the wild. So obviously, we wouldn't want to emulate everything that happens in the wild in a captive setting, and there are some things that we can protect them from in captivity so that they don't face those adverse situations. But obviously, clearly, there are things that are very positive and that we would want to try and emulate from the way that they live in the wild in as much as we can. And I think that things like trying to have them live in these sort of multi-generational family herds, related herds, would be a really positive thing. And I know that many zoos and captive facilities are working very hard to do that. And indeed, some are doing that. And in the studies that we've done, very preliminary studies looking at how elephant behavior and elephant welfare is affected by sort of increased relatedness, having these family herds, we have found that it does seem to have a really positive effect for them. There's a lot more of these sort of positive affiliated behaviors that we see between elephants, and a lot less of the agonistic or fighting behaviors that can happen between any animals that live together. So I think that those kinds of things are really positive. Trying to provide as much opportunity for choice, as you mentioned, is so important for any animal, us included, and elephants are no exception. So giving them more control, more agency in choosing where they are, what they're doing, and with whom they're doing it is a really positive thing. And we see many, many places now that are increasingly trying to provide those opportunities for elephants, and it has a really positive impact on them. Providing a really nice, soft places for them to sleep and lie down on, so piles of sand, can be a really, really positive thing for elephants. And we see both in zoos in the UK, but also in range countries where they've provided that. It's been really nice and really positive. And we see elephants using that. They'll lie down and they'll engage in lying rest more. And indeed, one of the other things that we see that's really nice and really encourages lying down, lying rest, or what we assume is sleep behavior, is when the elephants have the opportunity to physically touch other elephants. And so what we'll see, we've got these sort of overnight video cameras in zoos, and when we see elephants in these situations where they can touch other elephants, we'll see these what many elephant keepers have affectionately termed elephant piles, and they're literally just piles of elephants sort of lying down, touching each other, or even lying partly on each other. It's just lovely to see. And it's clearly an indication that there are these sort of positive relationships that they have with other elephants, and also that they're at ease, that they're able to be comfortable and sleep comfortably.
Yeah, that they're happy and they want to be together and they're enjoying. I suppose, having said that, like, we wouldn't give up, we want all of our freedom. Like, we've completely given up the state of nature to live in our sort of civilized world where we have to drive on the left and pay for our food and stuff like that. So I suppose, in a sense, there's a balance, right? And if we're creating a world that is just too nasty, yeah, maybe if you how do you do, like, with your studies, when you're looking at, okay, how can we tell what makes the elephants happy and comfortable and more comfortable, what measures we can put in place? How much of it is sort of observational, like you were saying about video cameras, and how much are they sleeping, stuff like that, and how much of it is sort of physical in taking hormone measurements and poo samples?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So there's a range of different ways that we can kind of assess animals' welfare, including elephant welfare. And there's both physical aspects of well-being that are really important, as well as the psychological, the mental aspects. So the physical aspects can include things like foot health. Do they have healthy feet that aren't cracked and don't have any sores on them? Body condition, are they plump or sort of more normal weight or thin? Things like their gait. Do they have any? Are they limping at all? Do they have any arthritis? Are there any indications that their legs are sore, that it hurts to move around on them? So those sorts of things are also really important measures to include when we're assessing welfare. But psychological welfare, mental well-being, can be a little tougher to assess. And so we've got a suite of different measures that we use to try and figure that out in elephants. And you're right, one of the measures that people have used and can potentially use is hormone measurement. So there are hormones that are produced by one of the glands in the body, the adrenal gland, and the hormone that is most commonly used as a proxy, as a sort of a way to assess stress, is something called cortisol, or corticosterone. And both of these are glucocorticoids. They're hormones that are produced by the adrenal gland under conditions of arousal, which can be stress. It can also be excitement. It increases with activity. So when we wake up in the morning, our cortisol increases, and animals' cortisol increases, other animals as well. Reproductive activity increases cortisol. Eating increases it. Being very physically active. And so it can be tough to figure out what that hormone measurement means. And that's where measuring behavior alongside that, seeing what the animal is doing when cortisol increases, can be really helpful as well. And so we think that looking at measures of behavior are also a really important aspect of trying to assess the well-being of an animal, or if it's happy, if you will. And so we talk about welfare as a very, what we call a construct, of a complex idea, theory, to try and understand. And because of that, we have lots of different measures to try and get at that, to understand, is an animal happy? Does it have a positive well-being? In the past, when we talked about welfare, we used to look at just trying to avoid the negatives. Does it have bad welfare? And now increasingly what we're talking about is actually trying to assess, do they have positive welfare? Do they have a good quality of life? And increasingly in welfare science, it's something that's being really emphasized, we're really trying to work towards really optimizing good welfare, good quality of life for animals and for people as well. So with respect to behaviors, we look at things like we make comparisons to behaviors that we see them expressing in the wild. So when we think about one of the measures of welfare that we traditionally use. One of the things that often comes up is the 5 freedoms. I don't know if you've heard of the 5 freedoms before. So freedom from distress and pain, but also freedom to express natural behaviour. So the 5 freedoms is something that was developed by the UK's Farm Animal Welfare Council, particularly and specifically for farm animals, for livestock, for food animals. But it's also then been applied to a lot of other species. And I think it's an incredibly important approach that has kind of informed our understanding of animal well-being, but something that we've moved on from as well. So there are other ways of assessing welfare, but if we use the 5 freedoms, one of those 5 freedoms is freedom to express natural behavior, and I think that's an important one, and something that has, as I say, informed how we understand if an animal has good well-being or positive welfare, and the best way that we have really of understanding natural behavior for a captive animal is looking at behavior in their wild counterparts. So understanding or having a good sense of how these animals, in this case elephants, behave in the wild can sort of help us to shape our expectations of how we would try and encourage them to behave in a captive setting. So we think about one way of approaching that is to think about how do we adapt or adjust the environment that we're keeping them in to try and encourage the expression of these natural behaviors. And so that's where we think about providing opportunity for choice. So rather than closing elephants into the elephant house at night, increasingly, and certainly in the UK, facilities are putting sort of flaps, these sort of plastic flaps on the doors to the elephant house, and they can just move freely in and out as they choose. And there's that really nice element of choice. They can be where they want, when they want.
Yeah, why should they have a bedtime? They can choose.
Absolutely.
They're fully grown.
Just so. And you know, when the day ends for us and the public goes home and then the keepers finish doing what they need to do to look after the animals, rather than closing them into their house, which would be at the end of a workday, the elephants can continue to move around inside and outside, and that's lovely for them. And again, so not being on chains overnight. So having that freedom to move around and to interact with the other elephants is really, really nice for them and really positive. And that's something that not only zoos in Western countries are doing increasingly, but also something that my colleagues are introducing in range countries. So again, rather than traditionally they would have them on a chain in an enclosure overnight, increasingly they're letting them off these chains so that they can move freely and do what they want in an enclosure and move around and lie down and interact with other elephants, and that's really positive for them.
The chains, I suppose, were historically a sort of obviously a control, but also like a fear thing, right? That you don't know what could happen. But do you
Absolutely. There's an element of safety that was really, really important, because in the past especially, keepers would interact with elephants in what's known as a free contact situation, where they're freely moving amongst the elephants. They can touch the elephants as they like, and the elephants can touch them freely. And that is very dangerous, potentially, to keepers. And many keepers in the past were injured or even killed by elephants that they worked with. And so increasingly, zoos have moved to what's known as protected contact. And in fact, EASA, the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria, has put out a policy that by 2030, all zoos will change to what's known as protected contact. So having some kind of physical barrier between the keeper and the elephants, so that there is less danger, much less danger, obviously, for the keepers that are working with the elephants. And so therefore, obviously, they wouldn't need the elephants necessarily to be on chains.
I mean, I was going to ask if you think that there's an element of sort of elephants becoming more tame or used to humans, as, you know, more and more of them are in contact with us, you know, every day, but clearly not so much.
Well, absolutely. I mean, as with any animal, the keepers or people that are working with elephants in captive settings in range countries, they'll train them. Elephants are smart and they can learn and they can adapt. And so, yes, and a very, very important part of being able to look after any captive animal, elephants included, is training them so that you can do what you need to do to them to look after them. Because as with any animal in captivity, because they're in captivity, there are certain physical needs that you will have to be able to touch them or interact with them to be able to look after them. So for example, with elephants, having them present their feet so that you can do foot care, to inspect them, make sure there are no sores. If there are sores, you can treat them, or if there are cracks, you can file them down. Having them present an ears, or learning so that they present an ear, so that if a veterinarian needs to take a blood sample to check them or to administer medications into a vein in their ear, they can do that. So that training is a really important part of having elephants in captivity, so that you can give them the care that you need to, or in case you need to get access to them to give them care if anything goes wrong. That's just an important part of having any captive animal, really.
Absolutely. Is there, with giving them more choice and more agency and more sort of freedom, does that also leach into their food? Do they get to choose what to eat, or is that still something that's being worked on?
Well, I mean, obviously in a wild setting, they've got lots and lots of trees and bushes and grasses around, and they can choose what they eat.
And they have to go out and get it, right?
And they absolutely go out and get it. In fact, in the wild, elephants spend on average between 16 and 18 hours a day foraging and feeding, going out and looking for food, because of the way that their gut has adapted. They are used to eating food that's very high roughage but very low nutrient density. There isn't a lot of calories usually in what they eat on average at any given time. And so they've adapted to eating a lot, but of very low nutrient density, low sort of lots of fiber, basically. And that helps keep their gut healthy. And so what we've learned and increasingly are trying to do in captivity is giving them browse, or the opportunity to eat bark and eat bits of trees. And that gives them stuff to do with their trunk and with their feet, but also helps with their gut health. It's really important to keep their guts healthy, that they have that roughage. But as you say, sort of giving them a bit of behavioral complexity as well. And so increasingly zoos are not just giving them hay, like bales of hay on the ground, but they'll give them hay nets so that they have to work to get the hay down. They'll give them browse. So they'll actually go out and they'll cut bits of trees down and they'll put those in their enclosure, or even have mechanisms inside the elephant house where they've got kind of these holders that will hold the browse up. And so the elephants will have to reach up with their trunks. And so there's an exercise element as well, which is really good for the elephants to kind of exercise their trunks and their bodies to kind of pull this food down, and then chewing it, and it's roughage, and it helps with their dental health, and it helps with their gut health as well. So yeah, I mean, obviously it's very difficult unless you are in a range country, and so that you have lots and lots of area and you know, hundreds or thousands of hectares to give them to move around in and choose their food. But in a zoo setting, obviously somewhere like the UK, you don't have that kind of space. But I think as much as possible, zoos are increasingly providing that browse so that the elephants do have that opportunity. But obviously they can't give them an enclosure big enough that they could then go out and browse for themselves. One of the challenges, particularly in keeping elephants in captivity and giving them that opportunity to browse, is that elephants are actually really, really destructive when they feed, and they'll knock whole trees down. And so many places that have trees in their enclosure, the trees are usually trashed in a fairly short time because the elephants are pretty hard on their environment.
Yeah, it causes big problems, right? But, you know, we all like to feel like we've worked for something. So you work obviously a lot with UK zoos, and it's really obvious the sort of changes that they're making. But out in you know, in African and Asian countries where they have more space in these parks and they're more sort of semi-captive, are you seeing a divide between the sort of organizations that are really on board with trying to improve the welfare and the situations of elephants living out there? Or is it sort of like, you know, a rising sea will raise all boats, in that even the ones that are really, really questionable are changing their ways? Or is it?
It's probably
us and
mix.
them?
It's probably a mix of things, and in range countries, there's also a mix of the ways that elephants are kept. So, particularly in Africa, there are quite a lot of reserves, small and large reserves, where elephants that are either semi-wild and have always been that way, or were captive and have been rescued and are now semi-wild, are kept. But there are also facilities in Southeast Asia in particular, especially in Thailand, in India, in Asia, obviously, in Myanmar, where there are captive elephants that are kept and are used for giving rides for tourists, or for having some kind of tourist encounter. I think there's a tremendous increase, a tremendous surge in a lot of these facilities really coming together as a group and trying to work together to identify what kind of guidelines they should adopt and ways that they should manage their elephants to improve captive elephant welfare. And some of that, I think, has just been a drive from the industry itself, but also increasingly, as you probably know, there's been a tremendous international pressure from the international tourist community to try and improve captive elephant welfare in range countries. And so many tourists and tourism operators are saying they won't go to facilities that give elephant rides. And so there are changes being made to accommodate that. And I think that's kind of both good and bad at the same time. So the difficulty is that giving elephant rides on its own, yes, may or may not. We can debate whether or not that's what the impact that has on welfare. But the difficulty is that how the elephants are kept and how they're managed and how they're treated and the facilities that they have may or may not be in any way related to whether or not they're being used for tourist rides. And so just boycotting places that don't give rides doesn't guarantee that the elephants are going to have good welfare. And the places that do give rides may in other ways really provide some excellent opportunities for their elephants in terms of positive welfare. I know of some facilities where they may or may not give rides, but they have hundreds and in some cases even a couple of thousand hectares that the elephants in the daytime can move around in and interact with the other elephants, and they've got mud wallows and water holes and lots of browse that they can eat. And so it's really challenging, I think, to identify at a particular facility whether or not they have good or poor welfare. And I think for tourists, I think that it's I would caution people in necessarily being able to judge whether a facility has good or bad welfare for those elephants purely based on whether or not they give rides. Because, for example, in the night, when the tourists aren't around, they may all be chained up and have very little opportunity to lie down. They may be kept on a very, very hard surface in a small enclosure, or chained up on a very hard surface, so it's really uncomfortable for them to lie down. They may or may not have access to water. They may or may not have shade. And the tourists won't know because they don't see that what's happening to them overnight. And so I guess I would just say when tourists are trying to figure out if a place has good or poor welfare, or if tourist operators are trying to make that decision, I would say be careful in how you make that decision, because it's not always easy to tell what's good or bad welfare at a particular facility just based on what you can see when you visit them.
Yeah, absolutely. I spent a few months in Thailand a long time ago, and I did go and do an elephant ride. My host family sort of took us there, and I didn't really think much of it then, and I was like, this is really cool. But then I felt a little bit weird about it afterwards, and then I decided to boycott all the rest of the trips. I was like, I don't think this is right. I don't want to do this. But that was all without any kind of research as to, like, who was I supporting, or who was I, by saying I'm not going to do anything, am I actually, like, is that a bad choice? And then recently, last year, I went to Sri Lanka and had a good look at, what are the kind of societies or organizations that I want to spend my money on visiting, ones where I'm not getting too close to the animals, that kind of thing. But it's a lot of work for someone if you're not really that interested, or, you just want a quick and easy answer. Are there resources or organizations that are sort of like pushing to change laws, or resources out there that can sort of guide people?
Yes, so certainly I know in Thailand in particular and across Southeast Asia, there are groups specifically that are working both to improve captive elephant management and welfare, but also to introduce guidelines on kind of minimum standards that every facility should have. And I think, and I would hope that once those are instituted and implemented, and these facilities are adhering to those guidelines, then that might be a good way for tourists to decide, well, if that facility isn't adherent to those guidelines, then I feel reasonably confident that those animals are going to have better welfare. Those elephants are going to be in a better situation, hopefully. And similarly, I'm working with some folks who are helping to work with a whole consortium of groups across Zimbabwe and Zambia and South Africa, similarly trying to introduce all kinds of improvements in the way that they're managing their elephants, but also to introduce a set of guidelines that all of those facilities are signing up to, that they agree that they will adhere to, again, very much informed by our understanding of elephant well-being and natural behavior from what we know about wild elephant behavior, but also informed by the work that's being done by zoos, and particularly the work that I've done with UK zoos, in terms of the principles that we know are important for trying to support good welfare and natural behaviors in elephants.
Because I mean, it's really, really crucial that we put money in the right place, right? This is becoming ever more the trend that animals and elephants are moving into captivity for safety. Another really, really cool thing that I know you're working on that I wanted to talk to you about, which, is another potential future if the wild, if we can't sort of change the way that animals are treated in the wild, is biobanks. So you're working on cryogenically freezing animals in case of extinction, right?
Well, so I'm part of a big team of people, both through the Frozen Ark project, which is about trying to preserve the genetic material, the DNA and the RNA of endangered species, and the more recently cryoarks, which is a UK-based project working on trying to create a biobank, if you will, a frozen biobank of material from different species, potentially, yes, also gametes, or the sperm and eggs of endangered species, to try and help preserve those, again, against the day when we may or may not have them out in the wild, but also to help how we're managing the populations in captivity. So we're working with the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria, EAZA, has a biobanking group, which is specifically working with zoos all across Europe, including in the UK, to help to collect and to preserve samples, tissue samples, blood samples, and yes, sometimes gametes as well from the animals that they have. But then also working with colleagues that are doing research on animals in the wild and might have tissues or other materials that they have saved from the work that they've done with those species. And you're right, it is kind of, if you will, sort of the pessimist's conservation project, because in a sense, in that if we really do lose all of these animals off the planet, that at the very least, we don't want to lose all of the incredible wealth of knowledge that we could gain from preserving their genetic material. But also there are many, many scientists, researchers who study genetics and genomics, and comparative genomics in particular, and can really benefit from having these samples from these different species to do these phylogenetic comparisons to better understand all kinds of biological, physiological, medical principles. So it's that material can inform our learning and our understanding, that can help for future developments in medicine, in science, kind of understanding the world around us. But also, and crucially, and this is a big part of the IAZA biobank, is preserving that material to help better manage the captive population. So if we can use that for conservation purposes, so helping to, again, preserve the genetic material and the gametes from these endangered species that we are losing from the wild. Maybe doing studies to understand which animals need to breed with which animals in our captive population, so that we can better broaden the gene pool, make sure that we don't have any inbreeding happening, and can increase the number of animals that we have in captivity. So using assisted reproductive technologies, the gametes can be used for in vitro fertilization or artificial insemination, which happens with a great many endangered species in zoo settings, so that we can help to breed these animals where their populations are dying out in the wild. That can also be really important. Captive breeding and reintroduction of endangered species, which it can also be accomplished with this collection. Hopefully, it
Has
is
that
also
been a problem in the past in trying to save a species, but only really having ones where, you've got a brother and a sister, and it's really difficult situation.
Yes, or even if they're not breeding well. And I know of, sadly, a great many cases where we humans have extinguished populations out in the wild, and we don't have any way of continuing them in captivity. And yes, genetic bottlenecks also. We know, for example, with cheetahs, that we have that genetic bottleneck, and that the cheetahs that we do have are from a very small founder population, and so they are quite inbred, which we know that inbreeding in general as a genetic principle can lead to the development of more of what's known as deleterious genes. Mutations can happen, and those other genetic defects can develop. And if you don't have a broad enough gene pool to kind of help to mix up those genes and introduce stronger genes into the population, then your captive population or your small population, even in the wild, may die out, may not be very good at adapting to changes. There might be, if you have a large population with a wide genetic base, if let's say climate change happens, or something else drastic happens in the habitat, there may be some animals that have traits, the genetically based traits that help them to better survive in the face of that change. And so if you've got a nice broad gene pool, you've got just statistically a better chance that some of the animals in that population are going to have that trait that helps them to adapt and survive. If you've got a really inbred population, you just statistically got fewer chances of them having potentially some of the traits that are going to help them to adapt and survive if things change and adverse environmental circumstances happen.
Yeah, and that's growing inevitably, right? That's going to happen, that habitats will change and things will move, and animals will need to move to different habitats and sort of move up and down mountains and things like that, right? So,
if they can, yes.
If they can. How big are we talking here? What's the scale of your work? Is it is it a Noah's Ark? Obviously, cryo ark.
Well, I think it's not really my work at all. My role is very minor. I am just facilitating, trying to work with the zoos to help collect some of these samples. But this work, which is being led by Mike Bruford at Cardiff University, who is also the co-founder of the IUCN Conservation Genetics Specialist Group. He's been working for a great many years on conservation genetics in particular. And we've got colleagues, as I said, working very, very closely in cooperation with the EASA Biobank as well. And so, yes, through this project, we have, and it's kind of like the project is still in progress at the moment, and we're increasingly reaching out to our colleagues and partners across the UK in different facilities, in zoos and wildlife parks, but also research facilities and university researchers and scientists that might have tissue samples in their freezers that we can also use. So we're continually identifying them. So I would say certainly already, and I know our colleagues and partners at RZSS in Scotland and Natural History Museum in London already have, I think it's safe to say, thousands of samples that they've already biobanked, but we're increasingly expanding the number of samples. Some of them are physically kept at these particular hubs, as we call them, but a great many of them are just being kept by our collaborating partners at their own facilities. So zoos and other places have their own -80 freezers where they're just keeping their samples. And that's great too. You know, we certainly are not expecting that we'll necessarily be keeping and curating all the samples ourselves. And there's also liquid nitrogen storage at our hubs for keeping really those samples that are susceptible to degradation at warmer temperatures at sort of -170 or -180, which liquid nitrogen enables in terms of the temperature at which it can be kept. So
it's like a sci-fi movie.
it is. I mean, it's amazing when you go sort of behind the scenes and you visit these facilities. It's row upon row of these incredible -80 freezers and row upon row of these liquid nitrogen storage tanks, which are absolutely enormous. These big facilities, and it's extraordinary. And there's all kinds of backup systems in place because these samples are so precious. In case the power goes down, that there's backups which will automatically maintain the electrical supply to these freezers for these precious samples.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. How much is there room for much citizen science in this? Because obviously in the wild, isn't it something like 200 species a day are going extinct? Is there sort of a race to get out there and collect as many samples out in the wild as well, or is it mostly at the moment limited to working with organisations and zoos?
Well, we've got a number of partners that do already work with animals out in the wild. The thing is with these samples, you can potentially, if you find a dead animal, even with the sort of the decomposition that happens, you know, as carcasses stay outside and they start rotting and tissues go off, and unfortunately the quality of the genetic material degrades or can degrade fairly quickly. Some of it can still be intact and can be used, and there are colleagues such as the folks at the Institute of Zoology, the Garden Bird Health Project, where they have citizen science. They do have people that are literally phoning and saying, "Oh, I found a dead animal in my garden. Is this something that would be useful?" And they'll go out and they collect it, and they'll do a postmortem, and they'll take tissue samples, and they will save those sometimes. But also, crucially, some of these tissues need to be quite fresh because they do degrade so quickly, and they need to get into -80 or into liquid nitrogen very, very quickly. And in those cases in particular, working with the scientists that are out in the field and can collect those samples and preserve them appropriately is absolutely crucial. So there's a lot of really close partnership with a great many colleagues and scientists that are doing this. I mean, we there's no way we would ever be able to do this on our own, and we're utterly reliant on the many colleagues and collaborators who are very generously providing us access to their samples.
One thing, I've done sort of some work with the whole conservation industry in the past at different conferences and different sort of documentary projects, and the one thing that I've really thought stood out about the whole industry is this collaboration. There's these partnerships. Everybody knows everybody. Everybody's worked everywhere. Yes. Everybody's very supportive and very, very generous with their resources. It's really one of those where, you know, the odds are really stacking against everyone's missions, and it's such a difficult and far-reaching task. in all corners of the earth. That it's really inspiring to see such a global community working together. It's unlike anything else I've come across.
Yes, very much so. It's an incredibly collegial and supportive community, and in many ways, we just absolutely, as you say, we couldn't do it without them, and it is really, it is very heartening to see so many folks that are really, really keen to work with us. As I said, although we do have some incredible frozen collections that are kept and curated by our colleagues that are working with us on the project, there's also a vast number of samples that our colleagues are curating at their facilities, and they're just letting us know about their samples and making them available to the project and to other colleagues. And in many cases, our colleagues that have these collections have said to us, I'm just really pleased to know that my samples can also be of use to other colleagues as well. And so that's been really, really just amazing working with all of these folks that are so supportive of the project and very much share our vision for what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I imagine it's wonderful to be a part of. You said before that obviously that there may be uses for this in the future, for sort of bringing animals back. Are we at that sort of stage technically?
I mean, for bringing animals back, I would be very reluctant to say that that's necessarily what we're going to be doing with this, or how feasible that is. I mean, I know de-extinction is one of those buzzwords that people use, and I think it gets misused an awful lot. I don't think we're at that stage, and I think that there would be an awful lot of things that would need to be in place for that to be done successfully. So even where gametes can be used, for example, and they are used for artificial insemination, or even for in vitro fertilization, that in and of itself isn't enough to bring a species back from the brink. Because if we want them to exist out in the wild, which is, I suppose, our ideal, we need to then obviously address all of the circumstances that made them go extinct in the wild in the first place. So whether that's just a loss of habitat, loss of availability of food resources, of water, an inability to sort of range over their natural home range that they would have, for a species like elephants, which are going extinct in the wild, it's about being able to protect them against things like poaching, which still happens incredibly commonly for a whole range of different wildlife species, including elephants. So having those protections in place, making sure that there's a protected space for them, that they have enough space and also a large enough population to be genetically viable, so that we avoid all of those genetic bottleneck effects that I mentioned. All of those challenges would have to be addressed before even trying to just do captive breeding and reintroduction. And then ensuring that if we're doing captive breeding and reintroduction, ensuring that the animals themselves, that we have to do risk assessments in terms of disease. Are there diseases that animals in the wild have, pathogens that the captive population hasn't been exposed to, so they might be susceptible, or vice versa? If we release this new population, would they be introducing diseases into the wild? So that has to be considered and addressed. But also, if they're captive born, do they have the knowledge, the behaviors, the instincts to be able to survive? If they're a prey species, an animal that would normally be potentially killed by predators out in the wild, do they know how to hide from and avoid the predators? If they're predators, do they know how to hunt for their own food? And that's
Is there anyone there to teach them?
Yes. Well, that's stuff that there are places actually that have been trying to do exactly that, to basically do some training to before they release animals out into the wild. But that can be incredibly challenging to do well, to do successfully. So there's an awful lot of hurdles, I think.
Nurseries, right? There are lots of nurseries for orangutans and other baby primates. Just when they're orphaned. Is that the kind of thing you mean?
For example, or even where animals have gone extinct in the wild and they've been able to breed them from captive populations, and then they look at trying to release those captive animals back out into the wild. Doing that and doing it well has an incredible number of challenges, and it is often a very expensive process. I mean, many would argue that we really need to do better at just kind of maintaining our our populations that are already living out in the wild if we can do, and to invest the resources in doing that and doing it well. But it does require quite a substantial investment sometimes.
You mentioned spreading zoonotic diseases that may not already be in certain populations. That is obviously going to be getting a lot of attention going forward, right? How much of the work that, the genetic samples that you have in the biobanks, how much of those can be used for understanding the dangers early on?
So just to slightly clarify, what I had mentioned was kind of any diseases that they might have. Zoonotic diseases are those diseases that animals can carry that could be infectious to humans, which is just a subset of diseases that animals might have. So there's other diseases they might have that they could just spread to other animals to make them ill. When we talk about zoonotic diseases, those diseases that animals can carry that people can get, that's a slightly different question. It is an important one, and obviously, with COVID-19, has sort of drawn people's attention to it again. It's something that people that are working with wildlife have been talking about for literally decades and decades, and it's been so
screaming
hard to get people to recognize that it's a really important issue, and that actually, ideally, what we need to be doing is doing ongoing surveillance and monitoring of our wild animal populations to see what's out there before it becomes a problem. And that's, that's tough to get people to really recognize the value in that, but it's incredibly valuable for a whole range of reasons to recognize diseases that can have an impact on other animals and animal populations, including endangered species. It's an incredibly important issue. But then also, obviously, humans are often most concerned about what's going to affect them. And again, many of our diseases that are circulating that can affect humans originated in animals, and of those, an impressive percentage, an important percentage of those have come from wild animals. And increasingly, as we continue to expand our human population and encroach on wild animal habitat, we're increasingly coming into contact with those wild animals. And so increasing our chances of getting exposed to some of the diseases, the pathogens that they carry. And whether it's our domestic animals, our livestock, or even our pets that are interacting with wildlife, or whether humans are directly interacting with wildlife, there are those risks of getting those diseases. I mean, in terms of the biobank being potentially a way to study those pathogens, potentially, I mean, we hope that that there aren't disease risks in the samples that we get. And certainly for our zoo animal samples, there's a much, much lower risk of them having pathogens that are dangerous to humans. We screen a lot of our zoo animals extensively for that and vaccinate them and so on. There is potentially still a risk, but certainly for the animals the samples that have been collected from the animals living out in the wild, there's a whole range of different pathogens that they could have, and some of them, some of them could be potentially infectious to humans. So I guess in answer to your question, it depends a lot on the source of the samples.
Yeah, I guess I asked because I read really recently in the news that there are researchers trying to use pangolin genes to understand why they have a different immune response to a lot of the diseases that sort of skip through them. So there was a theory that it was sort of a bat pangolin human for COVID-19, right? And now I think they're still trying to figure that out. But I just wonder if, but like you said, it's always just about, what is it that can benefit humans? Because they're obviously trying to find out if there's something that, protects them from feeling any symptoms that we can sort of steal. But
yes, indeed. And so, so I think that your point is very well made, that indeed there's all kinds of things we can learn from these samples that we have, including potentially what helps some animals to be more resistant to disease. In terms of infectious disease, but also things like how do long-lived animals, like elephants, survive and not have as many cancers as we would expect a long-lived animal to develop. So I was part of a study working with led by colleagues from the US who were looking at some genes that are expressed at a higher level in elephants, and in particular a copy of a gene called TP53, which kind of helps to correct when when in everyday life, when we are our cells are dividing, there are sometimes errors that happen, errors that crop up, and we have a mechanism for kind of identifying that and getting rid of those cells which could otherwise reproduce and cause cancer. And elephants have a very high number, copy number of this particular gene TP53, which helps to correct those errors. It helps to get rid of those errors. And there are other species also that my colleagues studied who are long-lived, who likewise have a high copy number of this gene. And so I think there are definitely lessons that we can learn from looking and from studying and from better understanding the various genes and gene expression from the different samples that are in this biobank, and that we hope to have more of in the future. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's so interesting about is it just because they're bigger that they have more of this going on, or is it something else?
I don't know that we know necessarily the rationale for why a gene is present or why things evolve the way that they do. It's an interesting dilemma, I think. Often we look at sort of favorable traits that an animal has, and I often have these discussions with our students here, and they'll say, well, why do they have that? Why do they have that particular trait? And I think that often we can say, well, animals evolve to adapt to the sort of ecological niche that they live in. But also I think with things like this, it's probably rather that animals evolve with traits which either improve their ability to survive and to reproduce and pass their genes on, or which maybe just don't have any negative impact. And so they will reproduce and pass those genes on. And so evolution is a bit complex in that way, and understanding how it affects animals and their genes and the genes that they express. It's a bit complicated, I guess. And it takes a bit of thinking, I suppose, to sort of wrap your head around it. But yes, I think it's really interesting to see how different traits evolve and different genes persist in animals, and where they do confer an advantage like this, obviously then it will help the animal to live longer, to reproduce, maybe reproduce more, and to pass those genes on to the next generation, and so they'll persist in the species.
Are there any other sort of interesting sort of tools that elephants have that you think might assist them in life, that you've come across? When you were studying your PhD, you were saying that bull elephants have very high testosterone. Is that purely just a mating strategy?
Well, so bull elephants, like any animal that reproduces, will, as far as we understand it, will produce testosterone, which is important for sort of developing secondary sexual characteristics, in producing sperm, so that the gametes that they will then use for reproduction. But I think in terms of the earlier part of the question, which is other traits that elephants have which are really helpful to them, I would say their long memory is incredibly important, but also I would argue that one incredibly important trait they have, which we could learn an awful lot from, is their incredibly strong social bonds. They form strong bonds with relatives and really strong bonds with friends. They have incredibly strong drive to support each other, and to engage cooperatively in tasks. We have evidence, we've got experimental evidence, so that helps us see that they really do that. They're capable of doing that, to look at a problem and realize, actually, in order to solve this problem, I need the help of this other elephant friend that I've got, and they'll do it together.
How has that worked? What studies can you do?
Well, so one of my colleagues, Josh Plotnik has done a series of really cleverly designed projects looking at how elephants solve problems. And so he created this this setup using some elephants at a captive facility in Thailand, where there was a barrier, but it had ropes coming through the barrier, so the elephants could interact with the ropes. And the ropes on the other side of the barrier were wrapped around this pulley system, and they could. It was this. I believe it was a table that had some buckets of some tasty food pellets on it, and they could smell it, and they knew that the buckets were there, and they wanted to get to them. But in order to move the table close enough that they could reach through the fence to reach the buckets and get the food, they had to cooperate, and each of them had to, in a coordinated way, pull on the rope at the same time, so that both sides of the pulley were pulled on, and it would pull the whole table towards them with the buckets on it. And it did not take them long to figure out that that's what they had to do. So one elephant approached, and they waited until the other elephant came up and picked up the rope, and then they picked up the ropes together, and together they were pulling on this rope, which pulled this table toward them so that they could get the food. It was amazing to watch, and very, very cleverly designed. But yeah, I think that sense of cooperation and strong family ties and looking after one another is one of the best resources that elephants have, and I think it's something that we as humans could learn an awful lot from.
Yes, definitely. And especially if it's not just, close family ties, it's all elephants, working together. And I'd be really interested to come back and see in a few years what more is known about how males group together, and how those bonds are formed and adapted over their lifetimes. How do you think that with the rope experiment, how do you think they sort of like conferred with each other? Is there like a physical communication, or is it just sort of like I want it?
I think it was done. I think it was. I guess the quick answer is I don't know that we would know that necessarily. I suspect that the training on how to do it was done in a way to help them realize that it was something. I think they started out with something that they could just do by themselves, so that they understood how the whole process worked. And then I think they kind of worked them up to seeing that this could only be done if they both pulled. And I would imagine, as with any task, when you're learning it, you kind of learn a bit by trial and error. So you try pulling it on your own and see that that really doesn't work. But I see that when my friend over there is pulling on the rope as well, actually that does it. That brings it towards us, and that is successful.
They realise at the same time and then do it. Oh, amazing. So it doesn't sound all that bad then. Being in captivity and being together, it's definitely getting better. And the role that zoos play nowadays, just worldwide, in research and conservation activities is huge, right? I mean, they're a huge source of income, which we've seen from this lockdown, for projects on the ground.
I think that it's variable, and I think that I don't think that anybody would say, oh yeah, all the captive animals have the best welfare they could possibly have, and it's great, and there's nothing to worry about. I think that we all recognize that there's always ways that things could be improved. I think that some places more than others, as with everything, there's some places that are doing a really amazing job. Some places that are working to make things better, or they need to work to make things better, as is always the case. And I think similarly in terms of the role that zoos are having in research and conservation is certainly continuing to increase. And as with everything, there's always gains to be made and always improvements to be made. And I think that increasingly, just day on day and year on year, I think zoos are really working towards doing more of that and trying to have more of an impact on that in all kinds of different ways.
It's definitely not all zoos, right? Did you watch Tiger King on Netflix? Did you manage to see that?
No, I didn't.
Oh my gosh. It became sort of like a viral thing. I'd look into the story, you might find it interesting, but it's about private ownership, but also zoo ownership of tigers and lions in the US. And it's a crazy story. But the public reaction, I think, was a guy was jailed for 22 years for poor treatment of tigers in a zoo. So
good. That's great. It's good to see that at least sometimes these things are caught, and that there are really repercussions for cruelty, which I don't think is ever acceptable in any context whatsoever.
Knowingly as well, like it's so clear. Certain levels of it are so clear. But do you think that how likely is it, do you think, that most of these charismatic animals that we love so much will go extinct in the wild in our lifetimes, and will only be able to survive in captive or semi-captive situations?
Well, sadly, I would say there's an awful lot of our charismatic megafauna that are going extinct in the wild. I don't know if we'll be able to stave that off, if we'll be able to stop that from happening. Certainly, I suspect that for many species, we'll probably, to be honest, there's no, or very almost no, truly wild places in the sense that we picture it in our minds, in our imagination, of sort of completely unaffected by human activities whatsoever, and that animals are just able to roam free and do anything. And I think that more and more and more, even in range countries, what we'll find is that animals will be in these kind of semi-captive settings. And so I guess what I would hope for many species is that they're in more of a semi-captive situation in range countries, where there's sort of a managed reserve that they're kept in, that they're protected from things like poaching or people putting out snares or poisons, and that resources are managed to ensure that they have enough resources within their environment, or that they're supplemented if needs be during a drought, to keep them going. So I hope that will be possible, but I would certainly imagine increasingly that the best we can hope for is having them in these kind of semi-captive sort of situations.
Yeah, and that we continue our research and understanding of how to put that in place. And, once this sort of lockdown is over, I've seen a huge outpouring of donations and philanthropy towards conservationist efforts, but that really needs to be increased year in, year on year.
Absolutely.
And work
Absolutely
like yours,
does.
so that as the situation in the wild becomes inevitably worse, that what we can do on the other side of it just continues to get better and better, right?
Indeed, and part of my motivation for working so much on trying to improve captive elephant welfare is the hope that what we're learning and the things that we're implementing can be applied to ensure that, all being well, if we do have these elephants in at least these semi-captive or managed situations, that we're able to try and provide the best welfare we can for them. And so the things that we're learning will hopefully continue to inform what we're doing and how we're managing these animals in captivity or in semi-captivity.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for your work in doing it. Thank you so much. And
thank you for your interest.
Yeah, thank you for coming on and chatting to me. I think that's probably a good place to wrap up, really. It's been really interesting to hear about what more needs to be done, and I think just talking about it more and more will help push that more does need to be done, and hopefully it will be done.
Yes, I'll be well.
What are you researching next? What's your next big study project?
There's a couple of them, but I would say probably the one which builds most nicely on what we've been talking about is we're just getting ready to so we developed a behavioral welfare assessment tool, which is currently being used by keepers all across the UK to use behaviour to assess the well-being in their elephants, and has been adopted, and it is being adopted by folks in various places overseas, working with captive elephants in range countries and in other places. And we are just in the process of finalising the development of an Android app for that behavioral welfare assessment tool, which we're then going to share with colleagues, hopefully worldwide. And so once they're using that app and we're able to start collecting that behavioral data on these elephants in so many different places, I'm very, very keen to then sort of compile a database of elephant behavior in these different settings to help us better understand and hopefully to build on ways that we can continue to learn from and improve how we're managing these elephants in captivity.
Oh, that's incredible. And as well, given agency to zookeepers all around the world to sort of learn it themselves rather than having to go out there, try to implement and sort of leave. That's a great system.
Very much so. I mean, elephant keepers are an incredibly dedicated and knowledgeable group of colleagues that we've had the pleasure of working with on these projects in any case. And many of them are doing this already anyway, but this kind of provides a more formalized way of capturing that. And also giving them the time, I guess, to just stop and look at and record and think about the behavior of their elephants and the way that behavior, they can use that behavior to better understand how their elephants are doing and how they're feeling. And kind of using that to inform how they're managing and working with their elephants. And we've had some really nice feedback from some of the keepers that we've been working with, saying that the tool has really helped them to kind of, because many keepers are so busy just out there working and doing the physical things that they have to do to look after the elephants and make sure that they're cared for, that they don't always have the time to just stop and just watch them. And they were saying that the nice thing about using the tool is that it does kind of make them just stop and watch for a little while, to take that time, and that they found that really helpful as well.
Get to know them.
Yeah.
How many places are you sending this out to?
Well, I guess time will tell. We're hoping to send it out to as many captive facilities as are interested, zoos, to tourism facilities in range countries. I've got a fair network of folks to contact to hopefully try and spread it as widely as possible, but it will be freely available to anybody working with elephants that would like to use it.
Because, I mean, what's the percentage of captive elephants to wild elephants? Is it about 50-50?
It varies. It varies a lot. So, for example, we know that in the wild, there are about 415,000 elephants that are living in the wild, roughly, as a very rough estimate, and probably about a tenth of that many Asian elephants in the wild. I'm just trying to remember the most recent. So in Thailand, which is the country where I spent some time living and working, I know that the estimates were there were roughly around 2,000 to 3,000 elephants in the wild, and roughly between 2,000 and 3,000 or 4,000 in captivity. So it's probably 50-50.
Right.
So it's very, very variable in terms of numbers, and I don't have at my fingertips how many elephants that we know of in zoos, and the difficulty is that there are different organizations that keep track of and report that, and not every zoo, in fact many zoos are not part of these umbrella organizations that do coordinate zoo work, so it can be tricky to have a very accurate estimate of captive numbers.
Yeah, and then I suppose you've got sort of private ownership where it's a very grey area.
Indeed, particularly in range countries, yes.
Yeah. Well, your work nonetheless is really crucial to the whole species.
Oh, thank you. I hope it can contribute. I would say that it rests and resides very much on the help and the collaboration with many, many colleagues.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. I hope I've helped a little bit as well.
Let's hope so. That's great. Thank you so much. Good to speak with you. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye.